Of all the things medieval Europe put on trial, witches, heretics, and occasionally basic common sense, nothing sums up the era better than the day a court looked at a dead baby, a guilty-looking pig, and said, "Right, let's lawyer up the pork." They didn't just kill the animal and move on like normal traumatized peasants. They summoned a judge, hired a lawyer, and opened formal proceedings against breakfast. Somewhere, a very serious legal professional had to stand in a courtroom and argue about the moral responsibility of a farm animal that thought crib was just French for buffet. This happened in France in 1386. Not in some backwater village where 3 people and a goat made up the local government, but in actual functioning medieval courts with real judges, real lawyers, and real trial procedures. The pig had unalived an infant, which is obviously terrible. But here's where things get properly medieval. They didn't just dispose of the animal and move on. They put it on trial. Full legal proceedings. The works. The trial followed every formal procedure you'd expect for a human defendant. Evidence was presented. Witnesses testified. The court took the whole thing seriously enough that they dressed the pig in human clothing for the execution, because apparently if you're going to publicly hang a farm animal, you want to make sure it's wearing trousers. The execution was carried out in front of a crowd, which tells you something about medieval entertainment options. This wasn't even close to being a one-off situation. In 1226, over a century earlier, another pig was burned alive in Fontenay-aux-Roses for devouring an infant. That's one of the earliest recorded cases, which means someone was keeping records. Someone sat down with parchment and ink and wrote "pig trial" in the official account books, right there next to grain taxes and bridge repairs. Pigs were the most common defendants, probably because they had a habit of wandering into houses and, occasionally, eating babies. Medieval pigs weren't the tidy pink things you'd see at a petting zoo. They were basically feral garbage disposals that roamed freely through towns and villages. Still, the legal response was remarkable. These weren't quick lynchings or mob justice. These were formal trials that cost money, required court time, and generated paperwork that would survive centuries. The court records from these trials detail everything: procedures, costs, who showed up, what happened. Some cases had defense lawyers assigned to the animals. In 1474, a rooster in Basel, Switzerland was put on trial for laying an egg, which the court decided was demonic. The rooster had a lawyer. That lawyer refused to defend it, which seems like a pretty solid career move when your client is a chicken accused of witchcraft. The rooster was burned at the stake. Animals faced 2 types of trials. Criminal courts handled the violent cases, mostly pigs who'd unalive people. Ecclesiastical courts dealt with animals who damaged property, usually insects and rodents eating crops. Rats would be formally summoned to appear in court. When they inevitably failed to show up because they were rats, they'd be excommunicated. Someone had to write those summons. Someone had to deliver them, presumably by reading them aloud near wherever the rats were living. Someone collected a salary for this. Over 100 animal trials were recorded in the 15th and 16th centuries alone, spread across France, Germany, the Netherlands, Italy, and Spain. These weren't isolated incidents in one particularly eccentric town. This was standard legal practice across multiple countries for several centuries. The trials transformed animals into criminals through judicial process, which is a fascinating bit of legal philosophy when you think about it. The courts genuinely seemed to believe that animals could be morally responsible for their actions and therefore subject to punishment. The 1386 pig case is particularly well documented. The sow was hanged, dressed in human clothes, after a full trial. The outfit was important enough that multiple sources mention it. Someone had to source those clothes. Someone had to dress the pig. Someone had to explain to the tailor what the garments were for. The mind boggles at that conversation. What's striking is how seriously everyone took this. These weren't show trials or symbolic gestures. Courts spent real money on these proceedings. Lawyers actually argued cases. Judges issued formal rulings. The executions were public events, suggesting the community saw them as legitimate justice, not entertainment, though one imagines the line got a bit blurry when a pig showed up in a vest. The practice continued into the 18th century, which means it overlapped with the early Enlightenment. Somewhere in Europe, a philosopher was writing treatises about reason and natural law, while, a few towns over, a court was solemnly debating whether a cow should hang for property damage. Both activities were considered normal parts of civilized society. What finally ended animal trials isn't entirely clear from the records, but they gradually faded as legal systems modernized and people started asking the fairly obvious question of whether livestock could actually form criminal intent. It took centuries to reach that conclusion. Centuries of pigs in clothing, excommunicated rats, and roosters burned for biological impossibilities that were actually just someone not understanding how chickens work. Medieval Europe managed to combine rigorous legal procedure with absolute chaos, creating a system where a pig could receive more due process than many humans while still being dressed like a peasant for its execution. If you were a medieval judge and a pig unalived a child, would you A. put it through a full legal trial with representation, B. just deal with it quickly and move on, or C. invest in better fences and call it a day? Let me know in the comments below. Until next time, stay unhinged.